Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you for the invitation. Give me 1 second because I want to share my screen. And can you see the slides? Great. And now let me change my view because I don't want to see myself. I want to see faces. So give me a second. And yes, that is Star Wars over there. Okay. Anyway, okay. So thanks for having me to discuss this really cool topic. Let me jump right in. I think that this is going to make things a little bit easier. Oops, too fast. So I want to start with a little bit of a disclaimer. Okay. So the first thing that you have to keep in mind is that this is not a course on the social doctrine of the church. Okay. So what I want to do today is to discuss. Okay. And because of that, and because I'm mostly a consumer on this, so I'm an economist. I work on things that have to do with competition policy, antitrust, collusion, that kind of things. My take on how we take social doctrine of the church to practice is obviously informed or biased, if you want, by my own formation. And because of that, I'm not going to sell this as this is a course on social doctrine. It's mostly I want to open the door to a discussion on how do we take social doctrine to practice. What I'll try to do as clearly as possible is to make the distinction between what the church says and what my thoughts are. I don't want to put in church words my own thoughts, and I'm going to try to make that very clear. Obviously, I just represent myself, and the joke would be that probably not always, but I'm going to try to just represent myself for now. Now, let me tell you a little bit about me. And the only reason I'm going to do this is not because I'm super interesting, but rather because I think that when you are examining an issue, whatever the issue is, it's super important to know where you come from. Okay, how you are approaching the question. That's going to speak to your bias. That's going to speak to your preferences. It's going to speak about where you are and how the issue relates to you. So for me, the starting point is to say I'm a Catholic, okay? And I'm not an economist who happens to be a Catholic. I'm a Catholic who happens to be an economist. That's my vocation within my faith, okay? And everything that I do or that I try to do is informed by that and is centered at that, okay? And that's going to be important. It's going to be important when I talk a little bit about my research at the very end and why I think that there are more principles that are important in guiding the kind of things that we do. But in particular, it's because I want to make clear where I stand, where I come to social doctrine. Okay, so that's like the very starting point. Having said that, I want to share with you this quote. So this comes from Father John Carchi, who was the chaplain of Shield Catholic Center when I was a student at Northwestern University. And now he's the rector of the University of St. Mary of the Lake, the Mundelein Seminary of the Chicago Diocese. So Father John first studied astrophysics at the University of Chicago, and he got a PhD in astrophysics. And after that, he went to the seminary and he got a second doctoral degree now on theology. And what he says in this quote is the following: as I sit with a biblical text before me, the draw of mystery is no less powerful than when I contemplate the origins of how the universe we see around us took form. As a person of faith, I know that God's infinite mystery lies behind both experiences. But take this part. But the scientist in me will not permit the believer in me to refrain from poking, prodding, and challenging. That is, I believe the human being fully alive, in whom God so glories. Why do I want to go there? For me, this part of the quote, everything is cool, but this part of the quote is crucial. All of us have talents. All of us have gifts. All of us have the opportunity to go further, to ask questions, to challenge, and to study. Okay, and that's something I definitely want to highlight today. In particular, because in asking questions from the perspective of I want to learn can never take us away from the truth, and it's definitely going to make us grow in whatever topic we are addressing, okay? This is going to be very different from saying, I disagree with a statement that you made before I even studied your statement, okay? And I'm going to make that point in a second with more detail. But again, we want to ask questions, in particular today about social doctrine, but that's what we're going to be talking about. Okay, so we're going to talk about the social doctrine of the church. This is more than what we would be able to talk in a lifetime. There's simply too much out there that we could consume and try to process. I'm going to try to be as selective as possible. Then I'm going to talk about challenges. And in particular, I'm going to be talking about challenges from the perspective of the economist. Okay, so how these challenges me, how I see that there are challenges out there. And in particular, I'm going to try to not address the obvious challenges, because there are some obvious challenges that you're going to see in the media, that you're going to see out there, and they're like, I like the entry-level challenges. I want to go like a little bit further and try to get you to react to those. And then we're going to take this to practice. Biases are going to become evident here. Oh, sorry, if I look that way, it's because I have two monitors here. I have my slides over there, I have you over here. So I'm trying to play with the two things. And when we talk about how to take this to practice is when I'm going to make the point that economics has something to add, in particular when we talk about policy, okay? How we address policy, how we evaluate policy, how we design policy. I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to say that economics has a lot to say along that dimension. But I'm also going to be very clear about what economics is not about, okay? And sometimes we forget that as economists. So I want to make that point as well. Okay, so the starting point here is there's a lot of background material, okay? And just to give you an idea, if you just want to look at the encyclicals, these are like a subset of the encyclicals that you could look at, and you're going to see that there's a lot of work that has been done by the popes in trying to take these to us. Why I'm saying this? Because I want to make a very clear point. The popes have thought about this, okay? Very smart people have been thinking about this topic for a long time. This is not something that the church came up with in the last 20 years, okay? Rerum Novarum is from 1891, 130 years ago. There's a lot of thought that has gone into these from different disciplines, okay? And this is why this is so important, because as I'm going to make the point in a minute, in these 130 years, the church has been very consistent in its message. On the other hand, if you take the position of ideology, that's not going to happen. You're not going to be consistent. The right and the left have changed positions over time on many, many issues. When we talk about the church's teachings and we address those, we're going to see that that's not the case. And what I want to say here is that as we approach the question of the social doctrine of the church, I am going to do it as a student. I'm going to say, there's a lot here that I want to learn. There's a lot here that has been thought before I even got here. And so I'm first going to study the context. I'm going to study the arguments. I'm going to try to understand what's going on. And then I'm going to conclude. I'm not going to go in with an ideology that's going to tell me, I agree with this, I don't agree with this other thing. Okay? So that's the approach I'm going to take. Now, there are other things as well. So the Catechism of the Catholic Church, I don't know if you have ever looked at where the social doctrine of the church is here, but it's in the chapter on the 7th commandment, you shall not steal. So there's a reason why it's there. The compendium of the social doctrine of the church, big book only on this topic. And the one that is my favorite, and this is going to tell you a little bit about my bias, is this book by Joseph Cardinal Bernardin. It's called Consistent Ethic of Life. And it's a big challenge. I actually think that if you really care about this topic, this is a book that you want to see, because it's going to tell you, as Catholics, as what the social doctrine of the church is telling us is, if you care about the poor, you also care about the rich. If you care about life, you care about life always. If you care about the elderly, you care about the elderly always, as well as you care about kids. And that message of Cardinal Bernardin is really, really powerful, but at the same time, really, really challenging, because normally we like to take positions. Ideology would often take us to stand on one side or the other. We may decide to favor the elderly instead of the children, or the other way around. What Cardinal Bernardin says is that that is not consistent. And that's the message that I want to highlight today. But we're going to have to make decisions down the road when we take this to practice. Okay, so what is the roadmap for today? Now I'm going to accelerate a little bit. I'm going to start with context and content. So there's like 130 years that we would like to summarize, because we have to lay the ground before we can discuss on actual policy. And the objective of that section is just going to be to show the consistency of the message. I'm going to go fast over that, because if not, you're going to fall asleep. The second part is I'm going to ask, like, what may economics bring into this discussion? And in particular, I'm going to talk about how economists think. Economists are really, really good at thinking about trade-offs, at thinking about, if this is the goal that you want to achieve, is that a feasible goal? And if it is not feasible, what is the second best? That's what economics does. We evaluate policy, we design markets. The question is going to be, well, how do we do that in the context of the social doctrine of the church? And how can we provide tools that are going to be informative and going to be useful for those making policy decisions? And then I'm going to talk about challenges, practical challenges. And in particular, I'm going to talk about some not so well-known facts. Some of them are well-known, but they're like kind of hidden, and others are super well-known. But the idea here is to raise awareness, to make a call for action, and not for ideology. I'm going to try to touch on topics on different sides, because I want to make that point. The social doctrine of the church is not about ideology. Okay, so context and content. So there's a lot to talk about here, but I want to start with you. So what do you think that the social doctrine of the church is about? And I'm actually going to take notes, and I'm not going to continue until you say something. So I teach, so this is what I do normally, so I'm sorry.
Is it Matthew 25, 31 through 46?
Okay, I need more than that.
Jesus talks about when the king comes into his kingdom, he will gather all the nations and separate them left from right, like sheep from goats. And he'll say to the sheep, go to heaven, because when you saw me hungry, you gave me to eat. When you saw me thirsty, you gave me to drink.
Yes.
Et cetera, et cetera. And
yes.
the goats get sent to hell for not doing
That's
that.
One. Says, so we're going to say what you did for, it depends on the translation, but for the least of my brothers, you did for me.
Right. So social doctrine calls us to see in anyone who's in need, Christ himself.
Absolutely. What else? Okay, one more.
Is it about stewardship, taking good care of what God has given to us, and material goods and the like?
Okay, let me save these before my computer collapses. Okay. Okay, I'm going to save that for now. So yes, so this definitely is part of what the social doctrine is, definitely. Now, when you ask people what, like in general, like, what do you think social doctrine is about? Most of the time, you're going to get a list like this. You're going to get things like abortion, global warming, environmental issues, the elderly, minimum wage, the dignity of work, the right to work, the poor, immigration, pornography, the right to medical care, and the right to education. I'm going to say, well, yes and no. So that's something that normally comes up when you're asking people and you're asking, like, what do you think, like, when it relates to policy, what are we talking about? So I'm going to say yes and no. I'm going to say these are topics addressed by social doctrine, but these do not define social doctrine. In particular, what I'm going to highlight now and for the rest of the talk, and this is what I want you to keep in mind, is the dignity of the human person. Okay, this is where we're going to make the difference between ideology and social doctrine of the church. It all depends where you come from. If you start from the dignity of the human person, and you always start thinking from there, you may agree on some things with the right and on some things with the left. If you start from the ideology, you're going to find yourself supporting ideas that sometimes do enhance or protect the dignity of the human person, but many times they don't. So it's not just a matter of initial conditions. It's a matter of understanding what's at the center, what is key to our understanding of the human person. So we are going to talk, everything we're going to say from now on is going to be about this topic, the dignity of the human person. So is this particular policy enhancing and protecting the dignity of the human person? Yes or no, for example. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the context. So this is some of the things that we just said. Matthew 25. Amen. I say to you, whatever you did for one of the least of brothers of mine, you did for me. So we can trace the social doctrine of the church to the Bible, to the very old Hebrew scriptures as well. But one thing that we see right away is that it's not just about solidarity, it's also about justice. Justice and solidarity are going to go hand by hand. So here's where we have the parable of the workers in the vineyard. Okay, so we're talking both about solidarity, but also about justice, and those two cannot be separated. We can go back to the Old Testament. The Lord God then took the man and settled him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate and care for it. So we're talking about the dignity of work is a commandment by God, even like in the Genesis. And then the rewards from that, you may exchange the money for whatever you desire, even wine or beer, look at that, or anything else that you want. And there in the presence of the Lord, your God, you shall consume it and rejoice it. This is the fruit of work, okay? In the Middle Ages, we start seeing that the dignity of work takes form because of its relationship with God, St. Benedict's Ora et Labora. And then probably the most famous church document on the topic, Rerum Novarum by Pope Leo XIII, that is all about the condition of the working classes. So this is a reaction to extreme capitalism of the Industrial Revolution. And it's going to talk about the dignity of work, the dignity of the working classes, it's going to talk about duties and rights. And that part is really important. It's not only going to talk about rights, it's going to talk about duties of employers and employees. It does talk about capitalism. It does talk about socialism. It talks about communism, but it's not about isms. It's about the dignity of the human person, okay? Let's jump up a little bit. So some of the things we're going to talk about today is the common good. We're going to talk about subsidiarity, solidarity, dignity of the human work, and where all of these topics are with relation to the church's teachings. I'm going to accelerate a little bit though. So for me, one of the starting points is when you start reading like the Catechism, and one of the first things you're going to see is the church's social teachings are principles for reflection. And these are going to provide guidance for judgment. The church is not going to propose an economic system, okay? And sometimes, I'm going to be honest, I would prefer to get a clear direction, like not just a guiding principle, but I would like to see more. So when we get in discussions about minimum wages, for instance, the economist in me understands the trade-off when we're saying about higher or lower minimum wages. At the same time, as we're going to see later, we do have a problem when we talk about income in the United States and elsewhere in the world. And we want to address those issues. But the question is, how do we take these moral principles to action? And we're going to talk about that. And then Pope Francis, but this is also in the Catechism, in an interview with La Stampa, said the gospel does not condemn the wealthy by the idolatry of wealth, the idolatry that makes people indifferent to the call of the poor. Again, this is a part people often forget. Okay, this is not about causing conflict. This is about trying to solve problems. Okay, so what is the role of the state in this context? It's going to be to provide for the common good. And here I want to stop for a minute, because I think that what we have seen in the last year is a very good example of when these things get mixed with my own preferences. When we say that the role of the state is to provide for the common good, the first thing that we have to realize, even if it is uncomfortable, is that that means precisely not a special particular interest, not even my own. Okay, so here's one of those things that, if you think about the pandemic and the response to the pandemic across countries, has been very heterogeneous. Like, let me see if I can find this somewhere here. I don't know. I have my mask over here. I'm in my office, so I don't have to use it inside my office. But there's a question there. I come from a country that has taken a very strong stance on whether people can be outside or in groups or stuff like that. But we often see different reactions by different groups of people. How do we trade off my own preferences with those of the broader society? Is it that difficult and costly for me to sacrifice a little bit for the good of the rest, even in a context of uncertainty where I'm not sure about the benefits of the actions that I may take? Is that costly? I don't think so, but we may have different opinions on that. Okay, but here's the point. We have to be honest with ourselves. We have to be very clear that many, many times my own interests are hard to sacrifice. Okay, but that's not the role of the state. Okay, so the state is going to provide for the welfare and comfort of the working classes, but at the same time, it's going to recognize, rerum novarum, that the only way for the states basically to grow, for countries to grow, is through work. Okay, so there is a role for private enterprise in particular. Now, that is going to lead us to the principle of subsidiarity. That is going to oppose all forms of collectivism. It's going to set a limit to state intervention. It's going to try to put together to what extent governments and governmental agencies, for example, and administration can lead into personal freedom. Okay, that's a big issue then within the principle of subsidiarity. And Pope Pius XI said, so this is one that I like because it presents the trade-off very clearly. Just as it is gravely wrong to take from individuals what they have accomplished by their own initiative and industry and give it to the community, so it's also an injustice and at the same time a great evil and disturbance of the right order to assign to a greater and higher organization what lesser and subordinate organizations can do. And this is particularly true in a country like in the one we live, where individual freedom and freedom of lesser organizations is protected, but that's not true everywhere. Okay, and that's going to raise challenge often. Okay, so a couple of things that I want to go in because I want to start talking about economics in a minute. In Rerum Novarum, one of the things that is going to be critical is this one. So it says, then if a family finds itself in exceeding distress, utterly deprived of the counsel of friends and without any prospect of extricating itself, it is right that extreme necessity be met by public aid. Okay, it is right because each family is part of the Commonwealth. However, the rulers of the Commonwealth must go no further. Nature bids them to stop. Here, nature bids them to stop. Paternal authority can neither be abolished nor absorbed by the state. I want to focus on this sentence over here. Extreme necessity be met by public aid. This is a call for action, in particular for those that are in the area of policy, because we have to define what extreme necessity is. And that means that we need metrics and we need to agree on that. And that's what the second part of this talk is going to be about. But that definition is something that the church is not going to provide. It's something that we have to provide. Lay people who are in the real world. We have to define what extreme necessity is and how we're going to meet that necessity. Okay, let me jump ahead a little bit because this is another example. And the reason why I want to use this example is because it mixes two things. One that is often quoted, but also misquoted. So also in Rerum Novarum, Pope Leo XIII says, let employers and employees reach free agreements, in particular regarding wages. That's something that if you have been in this literature, to say in some way, this is something that is often quoted as saying employers and employees should just go and bargain and reach agreements. But people, a subset of people stop there and say basically the church supports basically free bargaining, and we should not have any type of collective bargaining, for example, or unions or anything like that. But then, like, sentence that follows, Pope says, well, wages ought not to be insufficient to support a frugal and well-behaved wage earner. And then he says, if through necessity or fear of a worse evil, the workman accepts harder conditions because an employer or contractor will afford him no better, he is made the victim of force and injustice. So here the Pope is talking exactly about the opposite point. He's saying, sure, let them bargain, but at the same time, if there are asymmetries in that bargaining, then we have to recognize that as well. So let me give you an example here. Highly skilled labor, okay, super highly skilled labor. It's very likely that the employee is going to have a lot of bargaining power. Very highly skilled labor is movable and probably in high demand. So in that case, it makes sense because both parties, employer and employee, are going to have similar bargaining powers. On the other hand, unskilled labor is not going to have a lot of bargaining power. So in those cases, the second part of this prescription applies. How are we going to protect from exploitation unskilled labor? Okay, so this is a point. This is exactly the point where you're going to see the divide between just let the market work when there are no externalities, nothing happens, or no, we need full intervention. Neither of those is true. This statement doesn't support either. Okay, so it is often quoted, the first welfare theorem in economics, that says that people say, well, but one of the most important theorems in economics says that just let the market work and we're going to get something that is efficient. It's called a Pareto optimal equilibrium. But that particular statement actually only applies when there are no externalities and both firms and consumers are price takers. Well, most of the time, neither of those things are true. Okay, so what defines the theorem that most people are going to be quoting around to say that this is and that the market should just work without intervention is something that economists from like 100 years ago have all agreed that only applies in theory. Okay, that doesn't mean that on the opposite side, it doesn't mean that because the theorem doesn't hold, we have to intervene in every market. That's not true either. Okay, and we can get into that discussion later because that is precisely my line of work. Okay. Wages should be sufficient to allow a worker to support his family and by cutting down on expenses to put by some little savings and thus secure modest source of income. I'm going to show you this data later in the presentation. In 2019, the average American household had $255,000 in retirement savings. The average. The median, though, was $65,000. What is that telling us about the distribution of retirement savings? Is it asymmetric distribution? How do you think it looks like? If the average is 255, but the median is 65,000.
It means that it's top heavy and that there's a small number of people that have an extremely large amount.
Exactly. And we're going to see how that looks like. It's going to be super important down the road. In particular for like next decades, that's going to be like as social security benefits start like to have more and more problems, these type of things are going to start showing up. Okay, so let's jump ahead. St. John Paul II, actually when he talks about private property, he has this very strong statement when he says, well, private property is subordinated to the right to common use. And in particular, private property is in fact under a social mortgage. So for the church, private property has never been an absolute. Okay, for me as an economist, just thinking about that makes me nervous because it changes all the incentives that we provide in economic systems. Okay, so that's something we have to think about as well. Okay, so let me finish this more like high-level thing with a statement from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and I want to highlight one point here. Is point number 2. So point number 1 is kind of obvious and I like it, but I think it's a little bit general. It says the economists exist for the person, not the person for the economy. Fair enough. For me, that's kind of general. But the second one is the one that I really like and is what's going to allow me to link now into economics. All economic life should be shaped by moral principles. Okay. Economic choices must be judged by how they protect or undermine the life and dignity of the human person. That's going to be my goal. And that's what I'm going to get to discuss now. Okay. There are a couple of others. So now there are 8 statements here. They're all like super important, but those are I think the second one is the one that is the call for action here. Okay. So let me switch gears now because I don't want to be talking more than 10 more minutes or so. So let's talk about economics for a second. And then I'm going to talk about how this is going to lead us to policy. Again, what is economics about? If you have ever taken an econ course, you can tell me like what you did in that econ course.
Supply and demand.
Huh?
Supply and demand.
Supply and demand. What does that mean? Okay, I'm going to write it down though, but
the production and consumptions of resources.
okay.
My personal definition that I've been kind of working on in some of my own schoolwork or academic work has been the economy or economics being the engine which allows the support of other institutions conducive to flourishing, or so the engine that supports community or family life.
Okay. So if you ask an economist, you're going to get things like it's about markets, it's about prices, it's about policy evaluation. So some of my colleagues are going to really, really highlight policy evaluation. Others, and probably I'm one of those, I'm going to be more centered about markets and prices and how these impacts individuals. Macroeconomists are going to be talking about central banks. People that work on production are going to be talking about efficiency. But there's also a question of, for example, if we're going to be talking about inequality, are we going to be talking about access to education? Are we going to be talking about needs of specific groups? Then we're going to be talking about the rich and the poor, for example. I take all of these and I think, and this is something that comes from my first, is informed from my first economics course when I was a freshman, that I had this French instructor, French professor, that said that economics was about allocating scarce resources to infinite needs. That was his definition. And I have changed that a little bit, not because I think his definition was wrong. I think that he gave the definition for the freshmen that didn't know much about economics. But there's more that goes into that definition of allocating scarce resources to infinite needs. So first of all, I think it's super important to recognize that resources are scarce, and we tend to think that that's not the case. We forget about that. If resources are not scarce, then economics has no role, because we could just allocate to every possible need and we'll be fine. So resources are scarce, and that's going to introduce trade-offs. Because resources are scarce, we have to allocate them efficiently. So we have to define what efficient is, and that's going to be challenging. And finally, I think that this happens in the context of strategic agents who respond to incentives. That's a personal favorite. If I set a series of rules, the obvious example is if I give a problem set to my students and I say, you know what, it's a group problem set, just turn it in. Some of them are going to free ride, some of them are going to do the hard work. How can I provide the incentives for them to all try to contribute? I can come up, for example, with evaluation forms where all the members of the group evaluate all other members of the group. Or if I don't want people cheating, for example, or trying to prevent cheating in an exam, I could say I'm going to give 1 A, that's it. Everybody else is going to get less than an A. Well, the guy that probably was going to get an A is going to protect his test until the very end, so nobody else can cheat from him. So people respond to incentives. I'm going to give you some examples later, but not only people respond to incentives, firms respond to incentives. And the way we respond is purely strategic. We respond in the way that we think that's going to make us be in a more comfortable position within the framework that we're given. So that is going to be super important. For example, in my country, I think it was around May or August last year that the government approved a subsidy related to the pandemic. And there were around 30,000 government employees or public employees who had not lost their jobs, who had not seen their wages cut, who went and applied for it because they were not forbidden from doing it. It was basically free money to their pockets. Was that what the government was trying to do? No. It was trying to help those that were unemployed, those that had seen their wages cut. But the rules of the game were such that these people could do it. Now, there's a whole mess going on about that now, but people respond to incentives. And that's something that we have to acknowledge. We should never design policy thinking that people are perfect. They just respond to incentives. Okay, so why do I want to get into this? Because I think that there's a very important point to be made. Economics is not about telling us what moral choices should go before others. That's a statement, that's a decision that we have to make as society. And I'm going to give you an economic example in 1 minute. What economics is going to be about is going to be about telling you whether the goal that we want to achieve is feasible. How can we get there? How costly it's going to be to get there? If it is not feasible to get there because technically it cannot happen, what is the second best? What is the closest that we can get? It's going to make things real. So let me switch to an example because I think that this is going to clarify many of the things I have tried to say and maybe not so clearly. So consider the case where you have a government that has to decide which policies to fund, okay? How should we do this? So you have two policies. You have to decide which one to apply. And let's say that to make it simple, both cost exactly the same, but you can only implement one of them. What would you do? To make it more explicit, policy one is investment in childhood education, early education. Policy two is a housing voucher for adults. They cost exactly the same. And they will not generate more cost down the road, whatever. So cost is exactly the same. How would you decide, or what would you bring into the analysis if you want to make a decision? I'm not saying choose one over the other. I'm just trying to get you to think about what would be your line of thought? What would be your process?
Two things I would consider would be one, subsidiarity. So between the two ones, which one is sort of like the more appropriate role of government? So like, is the government solving a problem that's rightly like the government's problem or something that should be solved more by like local communities and families? And the second one is which one responds more to a more extreme need, as you talked about from your principles of the social doctrine. So which one is sort of like, would be sort of like a more extreme need given the society that.
I'm going to push you a little bit. Take it to this case.
So you said the first one was what, education?
Early education.
Early
like
education. And the
kids
second,
aged 3 to 5.
okay, and the second one was a housing voucher.
It's a housing voucher for low-income households.
So I think I would evaluate this subsidiarity. I think says that the early childhood education thing is something that's probably better solved if possible between like local communities and families and churches. And that's also a thing that sort of broadly applies to like everybody in society probably, versus low income housing is something that often gets sort of missed in communities because you often have communities that are maybe like separated from the rich and that
Sorry, I missed that part.
Directly to an extreme need, at least the way I'm understanding it.
So sorry, I missed the last point. when you're evaluating this subsidies for low-income household. That I miss the argument.
That low-income households, I think, to me, speak more immediately of an extreme need than early childhood education vouchers.
Okay.
Even that you might be giving like early childhood education vouchers to people who also don't have an extreme need for it.
Okay. So let me show you what economists would do in this case. Then we can circle back to, no, I don't want to circle back. That's like a Zoom thing. No, then we can go back again to social doctrine. So the economists would go and say, well, what are the benefits of this thing? If they cost exactly the same, and I have to choose between the two, I have to come up with a way to measure benefits, okay? And that is something that economists excel at, okay? So I want to give you this example. It's a paper that was published last year. This is not in my area of research, but I really like this paper. Is one of those papers that you read it and you say, this is how researchers, this is how honest researchers should be about what their findings mean. So the question of the paper by Nate Hedren and Sprague Kaiser is, which policies improve social being the most? Who should be targeted by public policy? In general, you would have to compute costs and benefits for this. This is difficult to do, but what they're going to do is they're going to look at past policies. They're going to look at 133 policies that were implemented in the United States in the last 50 years. And they're going to come up with a metric that is going to put all these policies on the same level. We're going to be able to put a number to all of them and to compare all those numbers. They're going to define, this is an academic paper, so the names to the things are maybe not so cool, but anyway, so it's a marginal value of public funds. That's what they are going to define. It's an object called the marginal value of public funds. That is going to be the ratio between the willingness to pay for a policy and the cost. What is willingness to pay? Willingness to pay is the benefits that the policy generates for the targeted population. Think of these as you invest as society, you invest in college education for a group of people that if not, they would not go to college. Those people are going to go to college, are going to get an education. We know that there are positive returns to education, so that's going to put them probably on a higher income path, okay? And they're going to divide that by the cost of the policy. The cost of the policy has two components. One, putting those people through college. But two, in the future, those people that are on a higher income path are going to be paying more taxes. They're going to need less transfers. So the future cost of this policy is lower than the counterfactual, where these people are not targeted by this policy, they don't generate these taxes, and they may need assistance. In that particular case, we would expect this MVPF to be greater than 1 and possibly very, very large and even infinite. There are other programs that are not so good. So for example, a program that reduces the willingness of people to work is going to be costly. People are going to receive funds and then they're going to work less and they're going to pay less taxes in the future and may need public aid. So in that case, the MVPF is going to be less than 1. And it could be negative as well. So they came up with this metric and they applied this metric to 133 policies implemented in the last 50 years. And this is what you see. So what they did here was on the horizontal axis, I have the age of the beneficiaries, okay, from 0 to 80. And on the vertical axis, I have the MVPF, the marginal value of public funds. And in this plot, I'm going to show you another plot in a second. This plot, everything is grouped by type of program. So here we have programs that cover child education or health, but also college education. And here we have programs like unemployment or housing vouchers or cash transfers, okay? The pattern, the average pattern is that policies that are targeted at children generate much more value to society than policies target adults. Is that a general result? No, there is a lot of variation. You have changes in taxes, supplement, everything. Here's one, okay? Something like that. So there are programs targeting adults that have marginal value of public funds that are very large. But there are many that are around 1. What is 1? 1 is like, if I'm the government and I give you $1, it costs the government $1. How much do you value that? $1. Okay, you're sort of indifferent. But there are other things, even targeting like younger people, like job training, that are not very, that don't generate a lot of surplus. When you look at these from putting all the programs together, you basically get the same story. So programs that are targeting younger populations are, so here's 20 years. Programs that target younger populations tend to have higher marginal value of public funds. Again, there are other programs that target adults that also have very large values, in particular if these have spillovers to children. Okay, so this is something that economics is really good at, like telling you how much surplus these policies are generating. But look at what the author said, and this is probably the reason why I like the paper so much. This is in the introduction. It says, given two policies A and B, suppose that the MVPF of A is 2 and the one of B is 1. Then one prefers more spending on policy A, financed by, I underline that, less spending on policy B if and only if one prefers giving $2 to policy A beneficiaries over giving $1 to policy B beneficiaries. Take this part. Whether this is desirable ultimately depend on one's own social preference for the beneficiaries of policy A and B. Economics is not going to tell you that. Economics is going to tell you the trade-off. Your social preferences are going to make you decide. Now, that's one part of the statement. The other part of the statement that is really important is that you are financing this by less spending on the other one. So there is a trade-off. And that trade-off has to be recognized. Okay, so let me now switch to the challenges. And with that, I'm going to be done because I'm 5 minutes over already. So a couple of challenges that I see that are super, super important. This is the distribution of income in the United States. This is coming from the survey of consumer finances. Since 1989 to 2019, the population is divided first in quintals, lower 20%, between 20 and 40, 40 to 60, 60 to 80, but then the last quintal is divided in deciles, 80 to 90 and 90 to 100. The normal thing that people say when they look at this figure is there's a lot of inequality because when you go from the 80th percentile, 80 to 90 to more than 90, basically income doubles, even at the very top of the income distribution. And people are going, and basically people stay in that. Like these people over here basically are getting most of it, and everybody down here is more concentrated. So normally what the discussion is about this difference, how the difference is huge here and how the difference is huge here. Okay. I want to make a different statement. So I'm not going to say that that's wrong. I'm saying that is there, but I think that there is a bigger issue here. The bigger issue is that let's go to the two lowest quintiles. This is the lowest 20% and the 20 to the 40%. First, look at the level. I want to focus on the level here. $50,000 per year for the lowest 20%. So this is the average income of households in the lowest 20% of the income distribution before taxes. $50,000 a year. Now, you add the 20 to the 40%, so this is the second quintile, sorry. You add that one, and it doubles immediately. Now, the level, $30,000 a year, is not a lot, but it doubles. So inequality, and this is a point I want to make, inequality is always there. There is inequality between the lowest 40% of the population. For these 40% of the population, the problem is not inequality, it's the level. The problem is here, It's not distribution necessarily, it's that inequality you're going to have always. The first problem is the level, okay? That's one thing. So not just focus on redistribution, focus on the levels that we need to be talking about. When you add the 40 to 60%, the same thing happens. The inequality is there, but the levels are higher. Of course, we're moving up in this higher moment in the income distribution. When you look at race, Hispanic and blacks are here, whites are here, and this is other that is a mix of everything. We have a problem here, definitely. But this problem is also related to the returns to education. So you get a college degree, you're in a higher income path. There is selection here, of course. Not everybody goes to college. People who go to college tend, on average, to come from families that have higher human capital and stuff like that. We know that. But investing in education definitely has some of the highest payoffs. Before I show you this one with numbers, this is retirement savings. When you look at the entire distribution, this is exactly what someone was saying before. The problem here is not a problem, but what's driving the 255,000 is this segment, this moment of the distribution. Over here, even for people that are in the 80 to 90% of the distribution, if you retire with $100,000 nowadays in the United States, you're not going to have your last years are not going to be that great. Okay. The same with assets. Okay, so let me spend my last 2 minutes talking about something that's closer to my research. So I work on industrial organization. Industrial organization has to do with the study of markets, with the study of firms, with the study of competition. This comes from a paper, a very nice paper that was published in 2019 by the flagship journal in economics, the American Economic Review. It's a case study from something that happened in Australia. So the authors look at Perth in Australia, where if you look at this plot, the plot is reporting average station level margins. This is essentially price minus cost. This is how much each station makes per liter, okay? Not per gallon, per liter. Before 2010, the average was somehow around like slightly below 5, okay? And fairly stable. Starting 2010, the average increased significantly and essentially doubled to 10. Okay, so the station started making twice as much as before. What happened in between was that one of the brands in this market, the green one in particular, this is BP in Australia, they engaged in signaling and price leadership, and they were able to communicate to the other firms in the market that they wanted to transition from this more competitive equilibrium to a less competitive equilibrium. And they were able to increase prices significantly and for long time periods. Here we have 5 years. So if all stations in a city are able to collude and lead to higher prices, people are going to be worse off for sure. And this is why when we think about markets, we think of collusion as being like the bigger sin that can be committed in a market, not just because it is cheating, it's because of how it impacts people. Like you are in Austin, how good is public transportation over there? You're laughing. So what happens if all gas stations in Austin collude? You're going to be significantly affected, okay? And probably lower income people that rely on their cars to move around are going to be more affected than higher income people. That's why, so collusion is bad because it not only affects the efficiency of markets, but because of the implications that it has. And this is closer to what I do. Okay, and to close, I want to close with a call for action. So I took this from a report that's called The State of America's Children, that every year that I look at this, it surprises me more, and I find it a little bit like very depressing. So in 2018, there were 73 million children in the United States. 10% of those live in Texas, okay? 21% of Texas children were poor. 27% were Black, 29% were Hispanic, 9% were white. The numbers are very similar for the United States, so Texas is not different there. In fact, in most of what I'm going to say, Texas is not different. I want to make the point that what happens in the US happens in Texas as well. 9% came from families below half of the poverty level. That is, let me see my notes over here. That's like less than $12,000 a year, okay? For a family of 4. 23% of children under 6 were poor. 100,000 homeless children were enrolled in public schools in Texas. In the United States, 1.4 million homeless children were enrolled in public schools. 11% uninsured. That's higher in Texas than in the United States, almost twice. Talking about education, and if we focus on 8th grade, 89% of Black, 81% of Hispanic, and 65% of white kids in 8th grade in public schools are not proficient in reading. At that point, it's already too late. Okay, I have been talking a lot about investment in early education. That's the key. By 8th grade, it may be too late. And the one that, because I come from a completely different country where these things don't happen, and I don't understand it, 63,000 children were abused or neglected in 2018. That's 10% of the number in the US, and 346 were killed by guns. That's also 10% of the ones that were killed in the US. This is a population of interest. This is a population that needs us. Okay, here is the challenge. Here is the call for action. This is the group that represents the least of my brothers. Okay, that's it. I have like a closing slide, but I think that it doesn't make a lot of sense to do that. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with this one. Well,